Welcome back to Magic the Gathering Guild Machinery, the video series where we don't play a game. We are not playing any kind of version of Magic the Gathering, but we are taking a look at the guild mechanics for the upcoming guilds in the Gatecrash set. And this time we're taking a look at the Simic Combine and their ability evolved. All the while we're also looking at the old guild mechanic, Graft, and some guild mechanics proposed by Top Tier Tactics, WiNGSPANTT. So let's get on to it. First of all, let me introduce the Simic for those of you who aren't quite familiar. The Simic Combine is Ravnica's steward of nature and the wild. Its mission is to preserve the natural world even as Ravnica's cities continue to grow. The guild seeks to protect the elements of the plane that are incompatible or mutually exclusive with its overpopulated urban conditions. This is not easy, of course, because the forces of civilization are so prevalent on Ravnica that they threaten to subsume anything that runs counter to them. But the Simic practice a strange combination of detachment and holism that provide a kind of separation from the larger urban systems, a separation on which their conservation mission depends. The Simic Guild is divided into sonots, which are huge sinkholes that leads all the way down to the Ravnican oceans, and each serves as a distinct Simic habitat, sort of an oversized inverted skyscraper. Each sonot has a different culture, ecosystem, and racial distribution, as well as a speaker. The Simic Guild members are organized by clade rather than by species, role, or caste. Each clade is the natural world equivalent of a project team. Diverse individuals adapted to different tasks, yet related by a common goal. Clades often exist solely within a single sonot, but they need not do so, and large clades span 2 or more Simic communities, whereas Momevik was the previous guildmaster in the Dissension set back in the first Ravnica block. Speaker Sigana is actually the new guildmaster. And here's a few words on her. The regal and reticent merfolk woman named Sigana is the current guildmaster of the Simic Combine. She is the speaker for Sonot 1, the first to emerge on Ravnica, and she delivered the Fathom Edict that declared a new beginning for the Combine. Sigana is quick to point out, however, that she speaks at the discretion of the Speaker's Chamber, a secretive body of all 9 of the Sonot speakers. She claims that the chamber can revoke that status, at which time another speaker would replace her as the guildmaster. Many outside the Simic believe this is false modesty, however, and that Sigana controls the chamber if it meets at all. The thing that this description doesn't seem to capture entirely is that the Simic are some pretty nifty and insane experimenters. They are the magic equivalent of neo-Darwinists, not in terms of, well, maybe perhaps in terms of racial propagation, but also, but more importantly, in terms of, and also the transhumanists and the transspeciesists of Magic the Gathering. They seek to evolve creatures to their utmost potentials. They're not conservative about keeping certain kind of archetypical traits, archetypical biological traits in a species if they see a potential for something better by crossing a species or evolving a certain trait of one species. So that's why we get the Simic Sky Swallower rather than just the regular Sky Swallower. As the flavor text of that card says, the Simic saw a different potential and unleashed it, and now it's much better for it. A little smaller, but it has Shroud and it has Trample, so much better. And flying as well, but I think the original Sky Swallower had flying as well. Anyways, moving on, I think it's time to look at some of the cards that ran the old or that sported the old guild mechanic, Graft. First of all, let's take a look at the Sporeback Troll. It's a pretty perfect example of a Graft creature. It's a 2/2 when it enters the battlefield because it has Graft 2. It's a 0/0 4 cost, and when it enters the battlefield, it has these 2+1/+1 counters on it. When another creature enters play, you may move a +1/+1 counter from this creature onto that creature. Which means that you could basically kill this troll by moving its counters onto another creature. But it has this added ability of it being able to regenerate target creature with a +1/+1 counter on it, so it can lend out its regeneration ability. At the same time, you don't have to graft your +1/+1 counters onto other creatures. These other creatures just have to have +1/+1 counters on them for the Sporeback Troll to be able to regenerate it. So that's pretty interesting. A very cool card in my opinion. The second creature that we see that sports the Graft mechanic is the Plaxcaster Frogling, which is a 3-cost, 1 blue, 1 green, and 1 colorless, and it has Graft 3 on it. It's a 0/0, just like I think all other, or at least most, I'm not entirely sure, but I think probably all other Graft creatures. And the fact that it has Graft 3 means that it comes into play as a 3/3, that is a 0/0 with 3 +1/+1 counters on it. This ability is a little different though, or its secondary ability is a little different. Target creature with a +1/+1 counter on it can't be the target of spells or abilities this turn. So that means that you can give a creature Shroud at your command as long as the creature has a +1/+1 counter on it. So already we're working with counters here, and this is gonna play nicely with the upcoming evolve mechanic, which we're going to see in the the Gatecrash set, for different reasons. But let's just sit back a little bit first. So first of all, there are some tricks to the Graft mechanic which are pretty nice. Like there are, I think it's, hold on, let's see. There's a nice card called Doubling Season, which you could play. It's a Ravnica card actually, and I think perhaps it's a card that would also work well with the Celestia, especially the Celestia guild of now, Return to Ravnica. It's an enchantment, 5-cost enchantment, green, that has the following 2 effects. The first one, if an effect would put 1 or more tokens into play under your control, it puts twice that many into play instead. If an effect, and the second one is, if an effect would place 1 or more counters on a permanent you control, it places twice that many on that permanent instead. That's pretty insane. You double your tokens, you double your counters. It also works pretty well with the Return to Ravnica version of the Golgari guild mechanic. So yeah, actually a pretty good card for many different kinds of decks, but it would work really well with the Simic, especially with Graft, but also with Evolve actually. Alright, so let's move on to top tier tactics proposals for cards. First of all, we have a mechanic called Root, which is pretty interesting in my opinion. In this case, it's an enchantment. It's a 3-cost, 1 blue, 1 green, and 1 colorless. It's called Deepwater Refuge. Deepwater Refuge. Yeah, I think that's it. As with all the other proposed top tier tactic cards, they are not real cards. So I found card art which I thought was sort of fitting. I do realize that this is not deep water. It's not underneath water. I just thought kind of a watery cave kind of thing, and it's actually harder to find a deep water refugee kind of thing picture on Google when you're just quickly browsing through pictures than one would think. Anyways, you get the idea. Creatures you control have root as long as you control 2 forests and 2 islands. So there's the clause right after root. There is a clause which means that there could be a clause. In this case there is, and in this case you have to have 2 of each of the Simic guild's basic lands. And root means that when a creature with root would be exiled or moved to a hand or library, it stays on the battlefield instead. This doesn't mean that it has hexproof or shroud. It does not mean that it is indestructible. But it does mean that now there's actually an answer for some very specific effects, which can be more or equally devastating. For example, the exile effect. You can destroy these creatures. You can kill them in combat, but you cannot exile them. So that's pretty interesting, and that is very interesting in terms of the law of Simic. Like, they found a way to root bind magically their creatures, so they cannot be exiled or bound to your hand or returned to your library or something like that. So that's very interesting. That's an original and very, very nice guild mechanic in my opinion that Wingspan proposed. So what implications would that have for limited, for example? You couldn't use Tristani's Judgment on this, and it would basically give you one guild where you would have to focus on traditional ways of getting rid of creatures. Exile is kind of a mechanic that was introduced, I think, to deal with regenerated creatures and so on, and also to deal with spells that might be cast from the graveyard or permanents that bounce back from the graveyard again. So that's interesting. By the way, it was called Remove from Game back in the days. So which implications would it have? Well, if you ran a combination of, like, I know nobody does this probably, but if you're very much into themes and the lore of Magic and so on, you might want to do something along these lines. You might want to run some Dissension cards so you can get the original Simic cards and mix them with these proposed cards, and you have Deepwater Refuge, put it on the table. Then you have Sporeback Troll. So now you have Regenerate, plus your creatures can't be exiled or bounced, and that is, it's not exactly hexproof or shroud, because you can do other things. You can tap them and so on, and you can't target them, but it makes it very difficult for your opponent to deal with. So root is it could potentially be a very powerful mechanic, and I like the originality of it, most definitely. Alright, the second guild mechanic that he proposed is actually, it's ridiculous how close it is to the actual guild mechanic that we get, except that the effect is a little different here. It's this particular card is called Adaptive Cytoplast. It's a 3-cost, 1 blue, 1 green, 1 colorless, a 3/2 ooze creature, and it has evolution. It has evolution 1, and whenever you cast a spell with the same mana cost as this creature, put X, which is the number after evolution, +1/+1 counters on it. So this basically means that it does seem from the wording that it's the other creature that gets +1/+1 counter on it. So it's kind of like Graft, except that it's forced, or it's not. I wouldn't call it forced because this is by no means a bad thing in most situations. Your creatures just become that bigger, or one bigger every turn, and you might have a creature that has Graft. Or that has evolution plus evolution 2 or evolution 3, so your other creatures become huge once you start or once you cast them. It might also be that the intention with this ability was that it was adaptive cytoplast, and that makes more sense in terms of the name, that gains the +1/+1 counter every time you cast another creature. And then we come dangerously close to, or not dangerously, we come surprisingly close to the guild mechanic, which we're actually getting in Gatecrash. But this, no matter if it's one way or the other, I think it could work really, really well with the original guild mechanic Graft. Just for the fact that it's again dealing with the counters. There are a lot of Graft creatures that use or which sport some kind of ability where they you can move around the +1/+1 counters, or you can regenerate or give shroud to a creature with the +1/+1 counters, and a lot of other abilities which are very, very interesting. But I think the thing that we actually end up with is at least as interesting, and probably way more interesting. Not because it's necessarily more powerful, but because it leads into some other secondary abilities which are very, very nice, and because it is tricky. It is not only tricky for your opponent, but it's tricky for yourself. You have to put together a really good deck that works with the mechanic, and it can be really, really good, at least in my opinion. Alright, so I decided to include a few cards proposed by a guy called Aluminum Can on the Magic the Gathering Salvation forums, just to have a little bit of variety and give a sense of what the community is thinking in terms of when they speculate about the upcoming guild mechanic. And in this case, it is a guild mechanic called Hybridize, which is on the, like, when you just at first glance, it doesn't look very impressive. It's basically just an ability, or it's basically just an ability where you sacrifice the creature in hand and cast it as a sorcery instead. Put a +1/+1 counter on target creature, and that creature gains this card's other abilities. And it is a, I think he basically wanted it to be a way of turning your creatures into auras, which I think is pretty nice. That actually, like, the more I thought about it, the more I actually thought it worked pretty well. This card, Finwing, is a 2-cost 1/1 with flying, which means that if you hybridize it onto another creature, that creature gains flying. +1/+1, plus a +1/+1 counter, and that's pretty awesome, I think, because it's a cheap creature. Late game, you might not value this guy as much on the table, so you might want to use him as an aura in a sense onto another creature, except that you can't remove him with remove enchantment type things like disenchant and so on. So I think that's pretty cool. Another thing that's cool about it is that this is a very easy way of taking advantage of many of the Graft creatures who has secondary abilities that give other creatures with +1/+1 counters on them. For example, Death Touch, like the Simic Basilisk, or for example, like we saw earlier with the Spore Back Troll, give them regenerate, and so on and so forth. So I think that's a very cool way of thinking how, like thinking Graft into some kind of synergetic relationship here between the guild mechanics. The second one that he came up with was Opalescent Tortoise, and aside from having a really awesome name that was difficult to find a picture for, or at least a decent picture for, it has hexproof. It's a 4-cost, by the way, 1 blue, 1 green, and 2 colorless. It's a 2/4 with hexproof and Hybridize for 1 green and 1 blue. So it's basically the same as with the fin wing, except that it gives, instead of giving flying, it gives hexproof to another creature. So that's pretty decent in my opinion. Cool card. It does not synergize as well with Evolve from Gatecrash, the ability that we actually end up with, as it does with Graft. But I still think it's a very nice and inventive way of thinking about these kinds of abilities. So yeah. Alright, so that was a quick aside. Let's turn our faces to the Evolve mechanic. First on the table, Experiment 1. Ooh, we like that name a lot. It's very, very Momiavik-ish. It's very, very Simic-like. This is the first experiment they came up with, which was to combine a human with an ooze. And what is awesome about that, it's a 1-cost 1/1. Well, the first turn at least. And then whenever you drop a creature that has at least one more point in power, or at least one bigger in power or toughness than this creature, you put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. That is so fucking cool. You start out with a 1/1, and then progressively, as you get through your land drops, you start dropping bigger and bigger creatures, and this creature is just gonna follow along. He's just gonna keep growing. So that's awesome. Now it does have a secondary ability which works pretty well as with the Evolve mechanic. Remove 2 +1/+1 counters from Experiment 1 and regenerate Experiment 1. Now that is pretty awesome as well, in my opinion. For the simple fact that, do you want to lose your creature in one situation, or do you want to keep them in a smaller version? So he spends a little bit of his evolved state, or like his new limb or something that he grew, or whatever. He's just somebody chops a little bit off him, and he's ready to go the next turn. He's not as strong as he was, but it works. It has a lot of flavor to it. It's a really, really cool card in my opinion. And the fact that the Evolve ability deals with +1/+1 counters works so well with Graft, in my opinion. So yeah, or potentially could work well with Graft, especially when you look at some of the, maybe not this creature, because you want him to be small from the beginning to gain those counters, but on the other hand, you could potentially on turn 2, that's probably a bit early, but like during the early turns, you could make this guy into a 3/3 and be able to regenerate him very early on if you have some Graft creatures in there, or if you drop a bigger creature every turn. Anyways, let's take a look at the Fathom Mage here on the right. The Fathom Mage is a 4-cost 1 blue 1 green 2 colorless, who also has evolved. So she starts out as a 1/1 4-cost. That's a little expensive if it wasn't for the fact that she evolved, and especially for the secondary ability. Whenever a +1/+1 counter is placed on Fathom Mage, you may draw a card. Ooh, nice. So here we see the Simic's ability to work their way through their library efficiently, give you that card advantage while creating bigger creatures. So there are still, like in the old in the Dissension set, you had these Simic creatures with Graft and secondary abilities that could move +1/+1 counters onto creatures, either as an ability or as either when you cast the other creature, or as an ability, activated ability. And this would work so well with Fathom Mage, and I see a potential for a lot of trickery here. And if you cast, if you have doubling season down, this creature just gets you gets to be really big, and it gets a lot of cards fast. So, but the whole thing about Evolve is that it seems really good on paper, but you would have to run creatures that were bigger in toughness or bigger in power, to make sure that you buff your whole side. And another thing which I think is tricky but also a little bit awesome is that if you run flash creatures, big flash creatures, for example, if you want to run just the Return to Ravnica block, you have the option of running let's see, hold on. You have the option of running, well, there's the Skyline Predator, for example, which is a 3/4, which is probably, whoa, which is probably gonna buff a lot, like a bunch of your side. Perhaps not at this point. It depends. Like you're not gonna, you might be drawing some late games there, or some late game early droppers. But the fact that you can flash this guy means that you're able to surprise your opponent, make your like most of your side bigger, all the creatures with Evolve on them, and you do it during combat phase or something like that. So that's pretty awesome, I think, in my opinion. What else is there? Well, there's the Easy Static Caster if you're splashing or if you're running 3 colors, and there's of course a Hussar Patrol. Aside from that, there's just a bunch of things that you could run, which would fit the deck really, really nicely. So yeah, I could definitely see running a creature like Yiva, and a bunch of evolved creatures, because that gives you the option to drop bigger creatures later on. Even even running a bunch of defenders like Hover Barrier or something like that, and like running Yiva and a couple of Hover Barriers, or yeah, a Hover Barrier or something else that has Defender, and or it doesn't have to have Defender, but just get you a large creature from early on for not too many, not too much mana, and you might you might run a deck with 4 Hover Barriers, not so much to be able to defend, even though that's an added bonus, but to be able to buff your side across the board, or a Similar Defender like that. So I think that's a very viable option in my opinion, if you want to do that. Aside from that, there's just a lot of really, really good Simic cards in Gatecrash. You have which also deals, like, not directly but indirectly with the evolved mechanic. For example, Prime Speaker Sigana, the guild master, who enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it, where X is the greatest power amongst your other creatures you control. And you may draw, when she enters the battlefield, you may draw cards equal to its power. So it's kind of, I think you would actually bounce this back to gain some card advantage and drop him again, or drop her again. There's the Shamble Shark, which is a 2/1 with flash, and all your 1/1 creatures benefits from that, and it's a 2-drop, so that's pretty interesting as well. There's Urban Evolution, which draws you 3 cards, and you may play an additional land this turn. It's kind of like it's kind of similar to Explore, where you may play an additional land this turn and then draw a card, which is kind of like, it's kind of the other way around, except that it's like you don't have to worry about the sequence at all. But yeah, that's very interesting. It's a 5 cost though, rather than a 2 cost, but it is very powerful. You could run this alongside of Explore. There's also the Simic Guildmage, which works very closely with the +1/+1 mechanic. And it's very cheap. It has cheap activated abilities. Of course, it's just like the other guild mages. It's a 2 cost. It's 1 green, 1 blue, 2/2, and for 1 green, 1 blue, you may each creature you control enters the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter on it. And for 1 green, 1 blue, you may remove a +1/+1 counter from a creature you control and draw a card. So yeah, lots of interesting things. There's the Biomass Mutation, which for 1 or for 2 hybrid mana of either green and blue and X, you may turn your creatures into XX until end of turn. So if you have a lot of mana down, you and this deck or the Simic will probably lean towards getting card advantage. So you should be able to get to land drop at least 5, 6, 7 during the game. Yeah, it's you will be able to do some pretty nifty and tricky things with the Simic this time around, and I think Evolve is a much more interesting mechanic than Graft. But just like with Graft, the whole thing about the whole potential did not lie in the guild mechanic itself. It lied in, or it lies in the surrounding abilities, the abilities that use the guild mechanic. For example, with Fathom Age, the thing that, like, whenever you get a +1/+1 counter on Fathom Mage, you may draw a card. It uses this whole counter gaining ability of Evolved as an engine for drawing cards, and the same goes with a lot of other of these evolved creatures. So that's really interesting, and I think that's pretty much what we're going to see much more of, and that's what makes Simic very strong this time around. Another major difference between the Graft and the Evolve mechanics is that Graft is kind of degenerative. It's very affected by entropy in the sense that it dwindles down. You use this counter, or you have these counters, and then you have to just take them and put it onto something else, and your creatures become smaller. Whereas with Evolve, it's much more cumulative. It gathers, because your creatures they don't become smaller, they just become bigger. So I think in a sense, Graft and Evolve is very similar to each other as guild mechanics, but whereas Graft is more entropic, I would definitely say that Evolve is more cumulative. So that's another cool difference, and another thing that I think makes Evolve potentially a little bit nicer as a guild mechanic. So at least interesting, if nothing else. So what do you guys think? Are you looking forward to the Simic? What do you think about the Evolved guild mechanics? What do you guys think about Wingspan TTs and Aluminum Cans proposed guild mechanics? And how do you think that the Graft guild mechanics work in conjunction with Evolve? Are there any kinds of tricks that you could come up with that you would think, well, these would definitely work well? Like, this is a very nice way of taking advantage of Evolve. yeah, just let me know in the comment section. I always enjoy interacting with you guys. So anyways, I am multeyemeteor. This was Guild Machinery, this time with the Simic Combine. Later!